I normally come to things like this and try and give people an insight into what's going on in politics, but I'm begging if I know. I'm hoping you might tell me actually what's happening, because it's a confusing picture, probably more so than I can ever remember. Here we are in the aftermath of Brexit, but I don't think politics and the political class has begun yet properly to make sense of the momentous decision that the British people made, and in many ways is acting, I would say, going in the opposite direction, just at the time where we should be thinking about what is a 21st century education system. It seems that we're heading back to the 1950s selection and grammar schools, which seems to me to be an odd response to the analysis of the Prime Minister that we live in an unequal and divided country. I think that doesn't seem to me to be the answer to that. And then if you think also about the referendum and the sense of abandonment that came out from some parts of the country, it seemed odd to me that the government should be hinting that it's about to pull the plug on its own Northern Powerhouse. I would argue that the right response to Brexit is to deepen the commitment to the Northern Powerhouse, not abandon it. And these are arguments that I will be making very strongly through the coming party conference period. I think Brexit is the issue of the day, and I think everything, whatever we're discussing today about powering the North and the new economy of the North, powered by digital and other sectors, I think you've got to start with understanding what has just happened. We need to now to get to a real understanding of what has just happened. Why did people vote in the way that they did, and what is the correct response to it? So let me just talk about Greater Manchester, because, as Heather said, that's my focus in terms of the candidacy to be the first elected mayor next year. Well, what happened here? Here, of the 10 boroughs of Greater Manchester, 3 voted to remain in the European Union, but a clear majority, 7, voted to leave. And in numerical terms, where 600,000 people in Greater Manchester voted to stay in the European Union, 700,000 voted to leave. So that's the arithmetic, and I think you have to respond to that and make sense of that. So how do we make sense of it? Well, look at firstly the 3 boroughs that voted to remain. What unites them? What do they have in common? I would say they're the boroughs that have probably seen most inward investment in the last 20 or so years, including here in the city centre. Very welcome investment. They've seen the arrival of new industry, and particularly the sectors that we're focusing on today. They're probably the most demographically mixed boroughs in terms of the social profile of those areas, and they probably are the areas that have the strongest sense of opportunity, I guess, and stake in the future. Looking then at the 7 boroughs that voted to leave, including the one that I represent, what tends to be the unifying characteristics of those? They are the boroughs across the northern arc of Greater Manchester, so starting with Wigan, but then going eastwards to Bolton, then to Bury, onto Oldham and Rochdale. They're the former industrial areas of Greater Manchester, indeed of the country. This actually was the industrial capital of our country, going way back to the 19th century. That industry has been replaced by, not exclusively, but largely, lower skill and lower wage employment. They still suffer from large amounts of dereliction, and that is certainly true of my constituency. The last coal mine to close in my constituency, Bickershaw, is only now seeing building work taking place on it. 25 years since it closed. They tend to have poorer transport links, even though Greater Manchester has tried itself to improve transport in the last 20 years, and it has. It's still quite a patchy an incomplete system that leaves some parts of our conurbation more isolated. They tend to suffer from housing failure. So these were the areas where in the early 90s, large numbers of the traditional terraced houses were bought up by speculators for very small amounts of money. And Possibly those houses have changed hands many times in the 20 or 30 years since. But what that has led to is a large number of absent private landlords who don't care a great deal, actually, for the communities of Lee, of Radcliffe, of Middleton and other places, and Haywood. They care about just getting a rent check. They don't really visit. But the cumulative effect of that is they drag down the sense of pride in those communities. And because of that, because the rents are generally lower in these areas also then experienced the combination of lower skill employment with low rental market and housing. These areas experienced the greatest amount of new arrivals from the European Union, and particularly the east of the European Union. So that's the analysis of those areas. And I think it's what worries me a little bit about the response to the Brexit vote is a kind of lot of middle class angst about, everyone was misled and people have made the wrong decision because they weren't clever enough to understand the issue. And I think that is very arrogant and actually quite insulting to those boroughs. There are very good reasons why they were saying life isn't good enough. We haven't had a good enough deal out of Westminster or Brussels for that matter. We haven't had action to stop the undercutting of wages in our area. So why wouldn't they vote to say we want change? And that, in my view, if you were to really start to get to the heart of it, explains why the country voted in the way that they did. It's a howl of protest at Westminster and Brussels that says we want things to be different. It's Westminster that's given these areas a housing crisis. It's Westminster that has never brought forward a convincing industrial policy to put these areas back on their feet. It's Westminster, actually, that pulled the plug on that industry in the early 90s. In Lee, in my area, the mines closed. There was no real help to recover. Wigan Council has had to battle on, really, on its own. Bit of help from Greater Manchester, bit of help from the North West Development Agency. No real help from the national government to put our area back on its feet. And it's only beginning to recover its sense of self-confidence now. And that tells you the kind of incredible social change that these areas have had to live through. So my challenge is indeed to all politicians in my own party and in the government to develop a more meaningful response to Brexit. As I say, grammar schools, in my view, cannot possibly be the answer to what I am talking about, nor can abandoning investment in the north of England, because the Conservative Party rightly identified the divide that exists between the northern and the southern parts of the country, and had said that it would build a Northern Powerhouse to correct that. If they are to step back from that now, having won a general election, parading that pledge very directly in the faces of people here, I believe it would be as great a neglect of the north of England as we saw in the 80s and early 90s when traditional industry left without any other help being put in its place. So this brings me back to where I started. Where is the logical and considered response to Brexit? And the core of my point to you today is surely it has to be to deepen the Northern Powerhouse project rather than abandon it. And that is why I am leaving Westminster. I'm ready to commit myself to that goal. I am saying very directly that is my mission. That is my always has been actually what brought me into politics as a 15-year-old living in the Greater Manchester area. It's what has driven me as an MP. I've often complained about the London-centric nature of life, and particularly the London domination of politics, and I'm not prepared any longer to carry on just saying, well, Westminster isn't fixing it, but I'm still happy to stay there. Well, I'm not actually. To be fair to the government, they've created the potential for a real change with devolution to Greater Manchester and other parts of the country. And it's now up to us. What are we prepared to make of it? Are we prepared to make it what it should be, to rebalance this country? And that's what I'm prepared to do by making the move that I'm doing. So if I can, just to put some specifics on it before then opening up to the wider discussion. I want to just give you a few things directly that I'm going to do to make what I'm talking about a reality. The first is, I would say, the first thing I want to do is hold the government to account for their promises to the North. And the test will come in the autumn statement, and particularly decisions on investment in rail infrastructure. I don't believe you can power the North, in terms of the conference theme we're addressing today, without that first requirement. The first line on any industrial policy for Greater Manchester and the north of England has got to be investment in high quality 21st century public transport, and in particular rail, because east-west connections across this country are simply not acceptable. They are not good enough. We need new modern rail links linking the great cities of the north, and that must, in my view, be delivered in the autumn statement, because east-west rail links, I think, are the single highest public transport investment priority for this country, rather than even higher than north-south. And I believe that if the rumours are true that HS2 is being cut back to a point where it won't be able to link into an HS3 scheme, well, that would be basically to pull the plug on the Northern Powerhouse. So I'm holding the government to account on the commitments it's made to high-speed east-west rail, as well as commitments to replace structural funding for the north of England and Greater Manchester that may be lost by Brexit. You know, we are standing to lose hundreds of millions of pounds from structural funding. The government must make a commitment to replace those funds from Whitehall. Why is that important? Why is powering the North essential? Why is it essential to have decent rail? Because if you go out of here today and drive on any of the motorways, well, you'd be lucky to drive, to be honest, because they're at a standstill. The M6, the M62, the M56, the M60, they're full. They can't take any more. The rail is at capacity, and it's a poor standard. You will not have a Northern Powerhouse without that basic investment in new rail. The next thing I would say is, in terms of making this a reality, is it's going to be about courage, and it's going to be about courage to break the Westminster consensus on national policy, and that's what I'm going to do as Mayor of Greater Manchester. Let me give you an example of what I mean. I said a moment ago that the London perspective has dominated the political debate in our country for decades. I'll give you three examples of it. So let's firstly take housing policy. The national policy focus, to be fair, under governments of both colours, has been about promoting owner occupation. That's where it has been for the last 20 or 30 years, neglecting council housing and social housing and other forms of tenure. And that, in my view, explains more than anything why we have a housing crisis in large parts of the country. And that has to change. Or take industrial policy. The national focus has been on the knowledge economy, the skills economy, and it let manufacturing get sold down the river, and that particularly damaged the north of England. Or thirdly, take education policy. Education policy has had a national obsession with the university route. How do you get young people on the university route? It's the way schools are inspected. The 5 A to C's is about the young people on the university route. There's real clarity for young people on the university route. I say, what about the other 50%? What about the young people who would prefer a technical education? Why do we as a country continue to treat technical education as a poor relation, the second-class citizen, when Germany have a system that gives parity between the two? So, as Greater Manchester Mayor, I would want to break national consensus on those issues, on industrial policy that promotes manufacturing, on a housing policy that promotes the building of council and social housing, and on education policy that aims to give true parity to technical education and aims to give hope to the other 50% of young people who, in my view, are failed right now by the education system. If you don't invest in your people in that way, I again don't see how you can build a northern powerhouse. And I'll finish on this particular point. That strikes me as being the part of the big answer to Brexit. If I'm going to be Mayor of Greater Manchester, it will be wonderful to be able to go around Europe and the world extolling the virtues of what we have here, the place where it all began, the place where the Industrial Revolution started, the industrial capital of the country. What it has is a great strength in its history, its heritage, but also in its people. You know, people who are dedicated to what they do, who want to give back to their own communities. The strengths of Greater Manchester are enormous. But how are we going to sell it in the future? I think it's by saying we're going to invest in our people, and we're going to develop here the most highly skilled workforce that you will find in Britain. And how are we going to do that? By lifting the sights of those young people who want a technical education and helping all of those young people into a quality 3 or 4 year apprenticeship at the end of school instead of university. And we're going to ask the Greater Manchester Chamber of Commerce and the employers and the voluntary sector in Greater Manchester to help us with that, to make sure that there is a quality opportunity for every young person. And we're going to do more than that. We're going to knit together our schools and our universities and our employers to focus on the sectors that we think Greater Manchester can be strong in the future. Digital, materials, advanced manufacturing, life sciences. Let's choose the areas where we think we can be strong and then build networks around them, bringing the skilled workforce through in the future. That is how I believe we'll make ourselves attractive and competitive in these post-Brexit times. If we can say to investors around the world that if you invest here, you are gaining access to the most highly skilled workforce in Britain. And that is what I am seeking to do. It is that investment in infrastructure, rail. It is that courage to say we are going to do things differently than the national consensus. And then thirdly, it is crucially that investment in our people if we're to make the Northern Powerhouse a reality. I think we can. I have concluded that Westminster has failed the north of England. I think that is why we got the referendum result that we did. We live, all of us, in a very unequal and unfair country where people living in different parts of it do not have the same life chances, the same expectancy of a healthy life, a lifetime because of the health inequalities, but also where young people don't have the same opportunities to get on. I've spent a political career talking about this. I'm not prepared to carry on talking about it. I want to do something about it. It is time to rebalance this country. It is time to close the North-South divide. The new Prime Minister was right to highlight that as she entered Downing Street. But in me, she's going to have a rather large thorn in her side as I hold her to account for delivering on that. Thank you very much for listening.